Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Well, India has once again said that it is committed to no first use of strategic weapons under its nuclear doctrine. Speaking at the Conference on Disarmament at the 75th session of the First Committee of the United Nations General Assembly, India said that its nuclear weapons are meant to maintain a posture of minimum deterrence. Earlier this month, Foreign Secretary Harsh Vardhan Shringla said nuclear disarmament can be achieved through an agreed multilateral framework and India will push for it. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's nuclear doctrine. Joining me on the program today are Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda India Foundation; Sheel Sharma, former Ambassador; and Harshvi Pant, Head, Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Gupta, I'd like to begin the program with you first. So the last couple of weeks, India has time and again said that it is committed to no first use of nuclear weapons. This has always been our stance really as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, and it's been our nuclear doctrine, and we are reiterating that fact once again.
Yeah, I think our nuclear doctrine, which came out in 2003, and now it's really 17 years, and it has been quite consistent, and it hasn't changed at all, despite a lot of debate whether the no first use should be changed or not changed. That, of course, debate carries on. What it really means is that the government has considered all the pros and cons and feels that the no first use doctrine, which is really the faith in our deterrence capabilities, the credible minimum deterrent, and second strike is very much intact. And it is good that it has been reiterated at the UN, and earlier it has also been clarified at the Lok Sabha when there was a lot of discussion whether India is considering a revision. So this sends out a fairly strong signal that we are quite confident of our credible minimum deterrent, and we are in a position to deal with the threats. Of course, having said that, the fact also remains that the nuclear environment and the security environment in the world has changed quite dramatically and is becoming, in fact, worse. But the government would have considered all these factors and reiterated the faith in no first use, because that would be keeping in mind the necessity of giving a reassuring signal about stability, nuclear stability in the region.
Absolutely, absolutely. Talking about nuclear stability in the region, Ambassador, over the last couple of years, we've seen, living in this neighborhood, there have been several threats. Despite those threats, India has not, bitten the bullet. Like the previous speaker has already said, Mr. Gupta has suggested that we are very confident, really, as far as our deterrence capabilities are concerned, and we don't have to worry about any of these aspects. Despite all these threats, we have still maintained our stance as far as nuclear weapons are concerned.
When we transition to being a nuclear weapon state, that was actually meant to deal with these threats of coercion and blackmail, and we made sure that we are a nuclear weapon state and we can have assured retaliation. So that message was what we conveyed when we made the transition in 1998, and subsequently in 1999 when the draft doctrine was discussed, and then as Director Mr. Arvind Gupta has said, that the 2003 doctrine. Now, this doctrine actually is a defensive doctrine, but it assures of a credibility of a retaliation. So the message is clear to our adversary that don't even think about using nuclear weapons against us, because the retaliation will be massive and unacceptable. So this is the message. We are not for aggression, but in case you were to get into a misadventure, our retaliation will be swift and massive. That is the message. Now, for that, we have prepared over the last 20 years since the 98 test and and these 17 years since the doctrine. We have developed, our tried and the survivability and the ability to inflict damage in case these things are thrust upon us. And we have been successful. And technologically, our systems are moving forward. So, and none of them actually has any aggressive edge. It's all, meant to be a defensive posture. I feel that in the nuclear age, the only stability which can come will come from a defensive posture. Anything which is aggressive, it leads to counter reactions, stability, instability, and it actually then, without a country knowing it, launches itself into a runaway arms race. So this aggressive route has never led to stability. The period of stability between the superpowers was also when they both realized that they could do this mutual assurance about retaliatory capability, so that neither side will venture into a first use. So this is the kind of a lesson from the nuclear age, and we have imbibed this very well. That's why our no first use doctrine is a harbinger of stability.
Absolutely. All right. Is this something that we can carry forward and ensure that more countries around the world buy this nuclear doctrine of no first use? Harshvi Pant, can we convince more states to go down that road?
The two adversaries that flank us on the border and that are on two sides of our sort of main threat perception, they are, I think, putting a lot of pressure, and they have traditionally also put in the past as well a lot of pressure on the global nuclear arms control architecture. So while for India, as a responsible stakeholder in the global nuclear architecture, it has always been the case that we would represent our case with a modicum of sobriety, with a modicum of one that propels stability, as the ambassador was pointing out in South Asia. That is not a paradigm that others have followed in the region. So clearly the challenge is very huge, that how do you convince other stakeholders that this is the paradigm that can continue. And at the moment, if you look, and I think Mr. Gupta was pointing out the challenge, that the nuclear environment itself is changing very rapidly. You had a situation at one point where Pakistan was the only problem. Pakistan's support for terrorism, for subconventional warfare, for tactical nukes, as they tried to proclaim it, that became a challenge. But now if you look at what China is doing, for example, rapidly modernizing and ramping up its nuclear base, and within and the bilateral nuclear arms control between Russia and America are no longer exist, and China is not part of that architecture in any case. So what you are looking at is China looking to America and trying to ramp up its modernization process, and at the same time, India trying to counter China along a conventional spectrum, which is becoming very, very difficult to sustain. So clearly, in terms of our bilateral issues, bilateral problems in the region, things may get very murkier, and I think that is a sense when you talk of nuclear doctrine and how nuclear doctrine needs to be constantly reassessed. That's a point that that many people have made in India as well. But I think the larger reality remains that as a responsible global stakeholder for India, it is also very important to reassure the world that it will continue down a path that it has started for itself, and it has no intention of rocking the boat unless others force us to do that. And I think that's a message that seems to be conveyed to that India seems to be conveying to the world, that we are where we are, our priorities, our policy options are clearly specified in our doctrine, in our posture, But if others are going to push us, then there is a possibility of a reevaluation happening. And that is always a case when nations look at the region, nations evaluate their threat perception, nations evaluate what others, in their periphery are doing. So I think the question now for the global community, for the global arms control architecture, which also is a point that was made in India's submission at the CD, is that global nuclear arms control architecture needs to revamp itself. It's breaking down almost. And I think unless something is done about that, India as a sole member of this, as a responsible member of this, has only there is only so much that India can do. So therefore, I think the question is, what are the pulls and pressures that are going to come on India over the next few years, over the next decade, as you see a very transformed nuclearized environment, and as you look at a nuclear arms control architecture that is breaking down, and what is the domestic debate in India about our immediate challenges? And I think that's going to be very, very interesting to see how the trajectory evolves.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point that you raised. Let me take that point forward with Mr. Gupta. Mr. Gupta, how do we deal with the pulls and pressures, of the nuclear architecture going forward? Do we need to constantly reassess our nuclear doctrine? Do we need to change with the times? What is it that we need to do really? What is it that we need to keep, a watch out for?
The nuclear doctrine had a provision for a reassessment. So one should assume that the government is constantly reassessing the security environment and doing whatever needs to be done. So that is why this is important that on the occasion of the 75 years of the UN, the government has decided it fit to reiterate its faith in the no first use and credible minimum deterrence. So they would have taken all that into account, the worsening security environment and the breakdown of the global nuclear arms control architecture, etc. So all that has been taken into account, and they have said that. But that doesn't mean that everything, you see, these doctrines are not written in cast in stone. As Mr. Pant said, the reassessment will go on, and we'll have to see how in future the security environment evolves. But the best course of action would be to make sure that your deterrent is in place. That is very, very important for India, and we should not take our eyes off that. That is one. And secondly, I think we have had a abiding faith in universal, comprehensive, non-discriminatory, verifiable disarmament. Now, that dialogue should also come back, and I think India, by its stature, by its impeccable record on non-proliferation, by its faith in nuclear disarmament, I think should continue to press for the global discourse on a nuclear weapon convention, global no first use, and many other initiatives and suggestions that we have made over the years. For instance, in 2006, we had given a working paper in all our initiatives were spelled out. So I think the dialogue on these aspects is also essential. So we should not neglect that part as well. So it's a two-track approach that we should adopt. Continue to improve your credible minimum deterrent. At the same time, also press for a meaningful global discourse on nuclear disarmament.
Absolutely. All right. So talking about nuclear disarmament, Ambassador, this is something that the Foreign Secretary also very recently, earlier this month, spoke about, that how, we need a multilateral framework really as if we have to address this particular issue. Do you see a consensus on this particular issue? How do we achieve this?
Ours is the only doctrine among those of the nuclear weapon states which actually puts such, pursuit of nuclear disarmament, multilateral nuclear disarmament, verifiable and non-discriminatory, as a part of our doctrine, which implies that though we have moved into being a nuclear weapon state, we feel that complete security is only even elimination of nuclear weapons, So that is our emphasis. And the statement made by the Foreign Secretary actually recalls the 1978 special session of General Assembly on disarmament, it is a landmark session where there was a consensus to move towards elimination of nuclear weapons and for prevention of nuclear war. That document, that final document of the SSOD1 is a landmark document. And India again reiterated commitment to that document. The important thing that is before the multilateral system today is that those who believe that they can somehow or the other manage the nuclear age, they are now coming to naught, because the arms control structure which they tried to create has foundered now, and both Russia and the US are walking back from it. The only thing which is remaining is the New START treaty, and if they give it up, it will be really a very damning state. So there, that kind of proves that you cannot live with nuclear weapons. You should think about first principles, and the 75 years actually is also 75 years of the Hiroshima, and so one should think about elimination and a step-by-step, time-bound method, program of working towards elimination of nuclear weapons through multilateral negotiations and in a verifiable framework. All this is doable, but somehow the other, multiple considerations of local or political nature, of a regional nature, of rivalries, they come to fore and drown this wisdom of the of people who I think I would say 2 or 3 generations of eminent persons who have again and again come back to the fact that elimination is the best way. And nothing could be more telling than the last year's Bulletin of Atomic Scientists coming out saying that 100 seconds to midnight. It's a kind of a graphic illustration of the danger that the world faces. Now it has come from minutes to seconds, and it is less than 2 minutes. And
Right.
So any misadventure or any mistake, miscalculation, inadvertence could lead us into a slippery slope, which will lead us to, most precarious situation.
Absolutely.
So in this kind of a predicament, we require to be firm on first principles. And India has actually reiterated these first principles, both in the CD and in the Foreign Secretary's statement, as I see it.
Absolutely. All right. So, Professor, let's talk about another issue. It was touched upon briefly, I think, by one of the panelists earlier. The issue of, non-proliferation now, and a few years ago, it was a widely talked about subject. People were very concerned about it. Does it continue to be a problem even today?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Frank, the two issues, universal disarmament and in some ways non-proliferation issue are also interlinked. So what seems to be happening is that increasingly, as you find geopolitical contestation increasing among major powers, the appetite for any kind of strict non-proliferation or arms control measures, or even the idea that non-proliferation somehow needs to be looked at as a multilateral problem, that seems to be diminishing. And that presents its own set of challenges. If you have countries which are so tied up in great power politics, if you have the dimensions that US-China relationship has taken recently, takes them in a direction that is almost like the Cold War, then the challenge for non-proliferation and arms control would be very similar to what it was during the Cold War. That by and large, the focus will be on how US and China come to terms with each other. And that's exactly what Americans have been trying to do by dismantling the arms control architecture with the Russians, by claiming or arguing that China is not part of this architecture. Therefore, what's the point of this architecture? So once once the major powers decide to take their eyes off the ball and concentrate on their internecine relationship or this great power competition, then I think the challenge becomes even more acute. That what happens to issues like North Korea and Iran? We have seen what has happened in the case of North Korea, and we know how the dismantling of JCPOA meant for Iran and Iranian nuclear program. So clearly, the challenge is that for the international community as such, how do you put pressure on major powers because unless they are on board, I'm afraid we are not going to get a credible, verifiable nuclear arms control or a nuclear regime of verifiable nuclear disarmament. And I think that challenge remains as acute today as it was perhaps earlier. And the larger context today in which we are talking about disarmament and non-proliferation is also a context in which multilateralism is breaking down across the board. Whether you are talking of WHO to WTO to UN, we are talking of a multilateral order which is in decline. So therefore, to think that multilateralism itself is going to solve a specific problem like non-proliferation would not do justice to the kind of challenge that it faces today. So I think for the larger countries like India that have a stake in a nuclear disarmament, both given that we don't want to expand our nuclear arsenal as much as the major powers do, and also the fact that our threat perceptions are such that it is not in our interest that nuclear profiles get expanded to that extent. Therefore, for countries like India, it is very important to put pressure on major powers to come to a modus vivendi on this question. But I'm afraid that's not likely to happen in the near term.
Very true. Very true. All right. Time to get quick closing comments now from all my panelists for the best way forward. Starting first with you, Mr. Gupta.
Yes, I think essentially it is an issue of multilateralism and global governance. And today we are at an inflection point when multilateralism itself is under stress, and all the structures that we had built earlier, including the non-proliferation, they are also now breaking down. So, as Ambassador Sheel said, we have to go back to the first principles, and I think this is the right time for India to build a discourse on a new multilateralism. And there we have to bring in new ideas on the table. And of course, I think probably we used to be very active earlier on disarmament and non-proliferation issues, etc. But somewhere I think the focus was lost somewhere. But time to get back. And today, I think our voice will be heard better than was the case earlier because of the stature of India, rising stature of India. Today, a dialogue with the major powers is possible, and I think we should continue to try and have that. And in the process, we should also, I think, talk to the public. The public has a different reading on nuclear issues and global security issues than the governments normally have.
Sure.
So I think that activity also should increase. So we really need a new discourse on multilateralism and fresh activity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ambassador.
Well, I wanted to emphasize along with what Arvind said, we need to educate the new generation. Somehow or the other, I get the feeling, being of a different generation, that there is a bit of complacence about the effect of nuclear weapons use. It needs to be borne out to people that it is still as horrendous as it was in 1945 when it was used against Hiroshima. There is no diminution in the risk and the danger posed by the nuclear weapons. So, and the whole generation should realize this, because from there arises the need to move towards, removing and reducing these weapons rather than worshipping them as some kind of a panacea for security, which is a complete folly. So that is required, for us. Second point, which I feel, which is very important, is that in the multilateral system, we should realize that we have been through similar grim situations in the past, though probably not as grim as this. In the 1980s, when President Reagan came in the first term, everything broke down between him and the Soviet Union. And in 1983, there was this Korean airline disaster where the Soviet Union shot down a Korean airliner over the Kamchatka Peninsula, suspecting it to be a kind of a U-2 type plane. Now, that was the abyss to which the superpower relations had come down in 83 or 84. But then within 2-3 years, they came to Reykjavik and then they started talking about disarmament. And Reagan himself said that these weapons are obsolete, we should eliminate them. And that statement which they made, Gorbachev and Reagan, that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That is a kind of a dogma that we should recover and say that this is what you had agreed. The biggest powers had agreed with this.
Right.
So there's time to recover some of these elements and bring it back to the multilateral system.
Absolutely.
Multilateral system, I find that has been bogged down with too much of petty geopolitics. Like, I mean, to give you a small example, this elections of Human Rights Council, where the Pakistanis get elected, it shows the fissures in the multilateral system.
Absolutely.
So that multilateral system has to repair itself. It cannot have high ideals to move forward to and still compromise with the devil. They have to come out forthright.
Sure.
That's what I.
Okay. All right.
And
And
Harshvi, idealism, not cynicism.
Okay. Points taken. Harshvi Pant, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
Well, I would just say that I think if one looks at the history of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, I think there are reasons to be a bit more cynical than perhaps Ambassador Sharma is there. But I think the larger point is well made, and especially for a country like India, I think, which views nuclear weapons not as an instruments for war fighting, but as political instruments for deterrence. And I think for a country like India, therefore, it is imperative that the dialogue on nuclear disarmament and the multilateral discussions get on board. But I think we also have to be realistic and make sure that our credible deterrence is robust enough to deter those adversaries who are ramping up their nuclear profiles. And given the challenge that we face, how do you manage your role as a responsible global stakeholder as well as manage your threat perceptions? I think that's going to be a challenge for India diplomatically, technologically, militarily going forward.
Okay. On that note then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that India is confident of our deterrence capabilities and we are very secure with our capabilities. We are clear as far as our nuclear doctrine is concerned. No first use. We don't believe in aggression, but if you try anything, any sort of misadventure, we will not spare you. Global no first use, we should ensure that this initiative of ours is taken forward in the right spirit and followed to the hilt. Big challenge for the international community is how do you convince the major powers about the seriousness of this particular issue. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.